The Saturday morning garage sale hadn't been Mia Reynolds' destination when she left her house that morning. At 68, her daily walks were her concession to aging, a regimen recommended by her doctor after her retirement from 30 years of teaching music at Westfield High School. But the handwritten sign at the corner of Maple and Elm had redirected her path, and now she found herself wandering among folding tables laden with the cast-offs of someone else's life. "Everything must go," announced a harried-looking woman in her 40s, gesturing dramatically at the household items scattered across her lawn. "Mom's moving to assisted living, and we've got to clear out the house by next weekend." Mia nodded sympathetically. She had helped her own sister through a similar transition 3 years ago and understood the emotional toll of dismantling a lifetime. She browsed without intention, picking up a porcelain figurine here, a hardcover book there, before moving on. It was the violin case that stopped her, black, battered, partially hidden beneath a stack of old National Geographic magazines. Only the curved edge was visible, but Mia recognized it instantly. After decades of teaching children to coax music from strings, she could identify a violin case from 20 paces. "Mind if I look at this?" she asked, already carefully extracting the case. The woman shrugged. "That old thing? My brother found it in the attic last week. No idea how long it's been up there. Probably Mom's father's at some point." The case's latches were corroded, reluctant to yield, but Mia's persistent fingers finally convinced them to release. As she lifted the lid, her breath caught. Inside, nestled in faded red velvet, lay a violin, or what remained of one. Time had not been kind. The wood was darkened with age and neglect, 2 strings missing entirely. A crack ran along the lower bout, and the scroll showed chips where it had been carelessly knocked against something hard. The bow was worse, warped beyond use, horsehair hanging loose and yellowed. "Oh dear," Mia murmured, her fingers hovering above the instrument without touching it. A middle-aged man with a baseball cap wandered over, peering over her shoulder. "That's seen better days," he commented. "Hardly worth the case it's in." "Probably not," agreed the homeowner's daughter. "Dad said Grandpa bought it from some traveling salesman back in the Depression. Wasn't worth much even then. Just a copy of a good violin." "A knockoff," the man in the cap elaborated unnecessarily, clearly pleased to display his knowledge. "Mass-produced. They made thousands of those factory fiddles. Stamped Stradivarius inside to fool people, but they're not worth the wood they're carved from." Mia barely heard them. Something about the violin's curves, the patina of the wood visible beneath the grime, it spoke to her in the language of craftsmanship that her years in music had taught her to recognize. Factory fiddles didn't age this way. Their wood didn't develop this particular luster, even beneath decades of dust. "How much?" she asked, interrupting the man's continuing discourse on worthless instruments. The woman looked surprised. "For that? I don't know. $5? I'll give you 3, Mia countered, already reaching for her purse. The man in the cap laughed. "You're throwing your money away, lady. That thing's beyond repair." Mia smiled politely but said nothing as she counted out $3 bills. Some things weren't worth explaining to strangers, like how she had once seen a student blossom from a painfully shy child to a confident performer, or how certain instruments carried histories that couldn't be measured in dollar values. "Does it have a name?" she asked as the woman handed her a plastic grocery bag for the case. "A name? It's a violin, not a pet," the woman laughed. "Though Mom used to call it grandmother's folly. Something about it being a bad investment." Mia nodded, carefully placing the bagged case under her arm. Sometimes value isn't about investment. As she turned to leave, the man in the cap called after her, "You know they'll charge you more to fix it than you'd pay for a new student model, right?" Mia just waved without turning back. Something told her that the true cost, and true worth, of what she carried would be measured in something other than dollars. Whether intuition or foolishness guided her, she couldn't say. But as she adjusted her path homeward, the weight of the case under her arm felt right, as if it had been waiting for her all along. The violin rested on Mia's dining room table, bathed in afternoon sunlight streaming through the bay window. She had spent the morning carefully cleaning decades of dust and grime from its surface using a soft cloth and techniques she'd learned from years of maintaining the school's instrument collection. With each gentle stroke, more details emerged from beneath the patina of neglect. "What secrets are you hiding?" Mia murmured, adjusting her reading glasses to examine the instrument more closely. The wood grain revealed itself to be far more elegant than she had initially thought. Under proper light, the back of the violin showed a gorgeous flame pattern in the maple, the kind of natural beauty that couldn't be mass-produced. The spruce top, though damaged, had a tight, even grain that spoke of careful selection. Mia reached for her phone and pulled up a violin anatomy diagram from a restoration website she'd bookmarked. Though not a professional luthier, her years in music education had given her a working knowledge of instruments. She'd rehabilitated enough student violins to understand the basics. "You need more than basics for this wreck," she told herself. A knock at the door interrupted her examination. Thomas Blackwood, her neighbor of 15 years, stood on her porch holding a covered dish. "Eleanor sent her famous lasagna," he said, handing it over. "She's worried you're not eating enough since the book club mentioned you've lost weight." Mia laughed. "Tell your wife I'm fine, just busy with a new project." Thomas, a retired furniture restorer with a perpetual skeptical expression, followed her inside uninvited, a liberty earned through years of neighborly friendship. "What project has you skipping meals?" he asked, then stopped short at the sight of the violin. "Lord above, where did you find that disaster?" "Garage sale. $3. "You were overcharged by about $2.99, Thomas said, bending to examine it. "This thing is beyond help." "I don't believe that," Mia replied, setting the lasagna in the refrigerator. "There's something special about it." Thomas snorted. "You musicians and your romantic notions. It's just wood and strings, Mia. And in this case, broken wood and missing strings. You restored antique furniture for 40 years. Surely you can appreciate craftsmanship when you see it." "That's precisely why I'm telling you this isn't worth your time," he said, but nonetheless pulled his reading glasses from his shirt pocket. "The crack along this bout will never hold properly. And look at the scroll, chipped beyond repair." Despite his dismissive words, Thomas had already picked up the violin with the gentle hands of someone accustomed to handling fragile treasures. His fingers traced the purfling, the decorative inlay around the edge, with growing interest. He murmured. Mia smiled, recognizing the sound of professional curiosity overcoming initial judgment. She waited silently as Thomas turned the violin over, peering inside through the F-holes. "There's a label," he said. "Probably one of those fake Stradivarius labels the man at the sale mentioned," Mia suggested. Thomas squinted. "Can't make it out clearly. Too dark in there." He looked up at Mia with the first spark of genuine interest. "You got a small flashlight?" 20 minutes later, they were hunched over the violin like archaeologists at a dig site. Thomas had fashioned a tiny mirror on a wire to see inside the instrument, while Mia held a penlight at just the right angle. "It's not Stradivarius," Thomas confirmed. "But there's definitely a maker's label. Italian text, date looks like 1890s maybe? Can't make out the name clearly, but it's not a factory stamp. So it could be valuable?" Mia asked. Thomas straightened, wincing as his back protested. "Don't get ahead of yourself. Even if it's from a decent workshop, the condition is terrible." "But..." He hesitated, examining the purfling again. "The workmanship has some interesting elements. These inlays are hand-done, not machine-cut. And see how the wood is graduated here? He pointed to areas where the violin's top was subtly thinner in certain regions, a technique used by master craftsmen to influence tone quality. I thought you knew furniture, not violins, Mia teased. Wood is wood, Thomas replied. And good craftsmanship follows the same principles regardless of what you're building. He set the violin down carefully. Do you actually intend to restore this? I do. It'll be expensive if you hire a professional. And time-consuming if you try yourself. Mia touched the violin's scroll gently. I've got more time than money these days. And there's something about this instrument that feels unfinished. Like it never got its chance. Thomas studied her face, then nodded slowly. I know that look. It's the same one Eleanor gets when she decides to rescue another stray cat. He sighed dramatically. I suppose I could help. My tools might be useful, and my workshop has better light than your dining room. You're offering to help? Mia asked, surprised. Don't sound so shocked. I'm bored since retiring, and Eleanor says my hovering is driving her crazy. He shrugged. Besides, I'm curious about that label now. But, he added, raising a cautionary finger, don't expect miracles. This violin might be nothing more than an interesting learning experience. Mia smiled. Sometimes that's enough. As Thomas left, promising to return tomorrow with his specialized tools, Mia returned to the violin. In the golden afternoon light, despite its damages, the instrument seemed almost to glow from within, a quiet dignity surviving beneath its scars. She found herself wondering who had played it last, what music it had created, and why it had been abandoned to an attic for so many years. We'll find out what you're really worth, she promised the silent instrument as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across its worn surface. Absolutely not, declared Philip Hargrove, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses with an air of finality. I cannot authenticate this as anything valuable. Mia and Thomas exchanged glances across the counter of Hargrove's Fine Instruments, the most respected string shop in 3 counties. After 6 weeks of painstaking work in Thomas's garage-turned-workshop, they had hoped for better news. We're not asking for authentication yet, Thomas clarified. We just need specialized replacement parts. The sound post, bridge, and pegs need to match the period and style. Philip sniffed, his thin fingers hovering protectively over the violin as if their very presence might further damage it. What you've done to this instrument already borders on sacrilege. Amateur restoration can destroy any remaining value. With all due respect, Mia said, keeping her voice calm despite the flush creeping up her neck, we've been extremely careful. Thomas has researched historical techniques, and we've only used reversible procedures. The luthier's eyebrows rose nearly to his receding hairline. Reversible? You've already re-glued the crack with modern adhesives. Hide glue, Thomas corrected. Traditional recipe. We've documented everything. The restoration had become their shared obsession. Thomas's workshop now featured a dedicated corner with specialized clamps he'd fabricated himself, jars of homemade polish based on 19th-century formulas, and stacks of research materials. Mia had sacrificed her modest vacation fund for authentic materials, while Thomas had disappeared for 3 days to consult with a former colleague who specialized in antique restoration. Philip adjusted his glasses again, a nervous tic that seemed to intensify with his disdain. The historical value, if there ever was any, has been compromised. I'd estimate its current worth at. He paused dramatically, perhaps $200 as a decorative piece. Thomas's weathered face remained impassive, but Mia caught the slight tightening around his eyes, the only indication of his disappointment. 6 weeks of 8-hour days, of hunching over tiny components with magnifying glasses, of debating the merits of different varnish compositions. All for $200. We still need those parts, Mia insisted. Whether it's valuable or not, we intend to finish what we started. Philip sighed with the exaggerated patience of someone dealing with stubborn children. I can order what you need. But I feel professionally obligated to advise against continuing. After placing their order and leaving the shop, Thomas and Mia walked silently to the park across the street. The autumn afternoon wrapped around them, leaves crunching beneath their feet, the air crisp with the promise of winter. He could be right, Thomas finally said, settling onto a bench. We might be polishing a pebble and calling it a diamond. Mia smiled faintly. Does it matter? I've never had so much fun failing at something. Thomas chuckled despite himself. Eleanor says she hasn't seen me this engaged since I restored that Queen and Highboy for the History Museum. He paused. But that had documented provenance. This violin, we still don't know what we have. The partial label they discovered had yielded frustratingly little concrete information. The date appeared to be 1893, but the maker's name remained illegible. Thomas had taken high-resolution photographs and enhanced them digitally, revealing what might be a Milano, and possibly a surname starting with B, but nothing definitive. We know it deserved better than sitting forgotten in an attic, Mia said softly. That's enough for me. 3 weeks later, with Philip's reluctantly supplied parts installed, the moment of truth arrived. The violin was complete, restored, restrung, and polished to a gentle glow that highlighted the natural beauty of its aged wood. The crack along the lower bout was barely visible now, the scroll repaired with such careful precision that only an expert would notice the difference in patina between the original wood and Thomas's seamlessly grafted replacement piece. They had invited Eleanor to witness the first playing. She sat in Thomas's leather armchair, knitting needles temporarily stilled in her lap, while Thomas stood by the workbench, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral. Mia lifted the violin to her shoulder. Though her specialty had been piano, she had learned enough violin to teach beginners during her years at Westfield. She positioned the bow, took a breath, and drew it across the strings. The first note hung in the air, pure, resonant, with a warmth that seemed to vibrate the very molecules around them. Mia closed her eyes, adjusting her finger position, and continued with a simple folk melody. The sound that filled the workshop transcended the modest room. It carried a richness that seemed impossible from an instrument so recently on the brink of destruction. Even with Mia's limited playing ability, the violin responded with an extraordinary voice, clear in the higher registers, deep and throaty in the lower ones. When she finished, the silence that followed felt almost reverent. Eleanor was the first to speak. "My word," she whispered. "That's not just any violin." Thomas uncrossed his arms slowly, reaching for the instrument with a newfound respect. "May I?" he asked. Mia handed it over, watching as Thomas examined it once more, this time with the eyes of someone seeing a different object entirely. "We need a professional player," he declared. "Someone who can really test what this instrument can do." 2 days later, Mia sat in her living room beside Thomas and Eleanor as Giulia Orozco, concertmaster of the Regional Symphony, drew the first notes of Bach's Chaconne from their restored violin. The music that filled the room was nothing short of transformative. Under Giulia's skilled hands, the violin sang with a voice that could only be described as exceptional, complex, nuanced, with overtones that seemed to shimmer in the air. When she finished, Giulia lowered the bow, her professional composure momentarily broken by genuine awe. "This is remarkable," she said quietly. The response, the projection, you don't find this quality in modern instruments, not even the expensive ones. She looked at Mia and Thomas with new respect. "You may have rescued something truly special. Where did you say you found this?" As Mia recounted the garage sale discovery, she caught Thomas's eye. In his typically restrained expression, she saw a flicker of vindication, and something more. Pride, perhaps. Not just in the violin, but in what they had accomplished together. The instrument that everyone had dismissed as worthless was singing again, its voice restored through patience, craftsmanship, and the stubborn belief that some things deserve a second chance. Julia's performance had only been the beginning. What followed was a whirlwind of activity that transformed Mia's quiet retirement into something entirely unexpected. At Julia's insistence, they had taken the violin to Eastman College of Music, where Professor Richard Donovan, an authority on historical instruments, examined it with the reverence typically reserved for verified masterpieces. "This is extraordinary," Donovan had declared, his fingers tracing the subtle curves of the violin with practiced precision. "Not quite a forgotten Guarneri as your friend Julia romantically suggested, but something perhaps more interesting, a violin from a lesser-known but highly skilled maker who never received proper recognition." Now, 3 months after that initial garage sale discovery, Mia sat in her living room surrounded by research materials, books on Italian violin makers, printouts of auction records, and photocopies from obscure music journals. Thomas occupied her armchair, reading glasses perched on his nose, poring over a 1920s catalogue of string instruments. "Listen to this," Mia said, excitement coloring her voice as she read from her laptop screen. Bianca Rossi, born 1865 in Milan, trained under her father Giuseppe Rossi until his death in 1887. She continued producing instruments under her own name but faced significant prejudice as a female luthier. Many of her violins were sold unmarked or under her father's label to improve marketability. Thomas looked up. "Bianca, that fits with the partial B we could see on the label." "And the Milano location," Mia added. Professor Donovan's analysis of the wood and varnish composition places our violin's construction between 1890 and 1895, which aligns perfectly with her active period. The doorbell interrupted their discussion. Eleanor entered, followed by a slender woman in her 70s who walked with the assistance of a polished wooden cane. "This is Lucia Moretti," Eleanor announced. "I mentioned her at church committee last week. She's visiting her niece from Chicago. When I described your violin project, she insisted on meeting you." The elderly woman's eyes were bright with intelligence and something like suppressed excitement. "My grandmother was Bianca Rossi," she said without preamble, her Italian accent still evident despite decades in America. "I believe you have found one of her violins." The silence that followed was charged with astonishment. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. "We've only just discovered her name in our research. Please, sit down." Once settled with tea, Lucia's story poured out, a narrative passed down through generations, preserved despite time and distance. "My grandmother was brilliant," she explained, her gnarled fingers curling around her teacup. "But in late 19th century Italy, a woman could not be taken seriously as a violin maker. Her father taught her everything, recognized her talent, but even he knew the prejudice she would face." Lucia described how Bianca had continued crafting instruments after her father's death, signing only a few with her own name, those sold to progressive musicians who didn't mind a female maker. The rest went unmarked or under her father's label to fetch proper prices. "She married my grandfather in 1897. He was a musician, appreciative of her skill, but even he encouraged her to focus on family after their children were born. The world was not ready for a woman luthier." Mia exchanged glances with Thomas, both thinking of the violin carefully housed in its restored case in the next room. "What makes this discovery special," Lucia continued, "is that very few of her signed pieces survive. My mother remembered perhaps 20 violins that bore Bianca's name. Most have been lost to time, war, or simply misattribution. Would you like to see it?" Mia asked softly. When they brought out the restored violin, Lucia's hands trembled as she took it. She didn't play, couldn't, she explained, due to arthritis, but she examined it with the familiarity of someone who had grown up around such instruments. "This is her work," she confirmed, tears gathering in her eyes. "These subtle curves of the F-holes, this was her signature style. And this scroll." She traced the repaired scroll with reverent fingers. "She carved them slightly asymmetrical, though you'd never notice unless you measured. A tiny rebellion, she called it. Her mark of individuality in a world that demanded conformity. Thomas nodded, a flash of professional satisfaction crossing his face. We noticed the asymmetry during restoration. I matched it precisely when repairing the damaged portion. My grandmother would be grateful, Lucia said simply. She believed her instruments would be forgotten. As the afternoon progressed, Lucia shared photographs, sepia-toned images of a serious-faced woman bent over a workbench, of Bianca with her children, of the small workshop behind their Milan home. The woman in the photos had Lucia's same determined eyes, the same strong hands. She never stopped creating, even when her work wasn't recognized, Lucia said. She made her last violin at 72, though by then it was mainly for family or close friends. Did she ever receive recognition in her lifetime? Mia asked. Lucia's smile held a mixture of pride and old pain. Very little. After the First World War, attitudes began changing slowly. A few musicians sought out her instruments for their unique tonal qualities. But true recognition? No. By the time female luthiers were being taken more seriously, she was already an old woman. Thomas, typically stoic, seemed unusually affected. That's the true crime, he said quietly. Not just the lack of recognition, but the loss to music. How many exceptional instruments were never created because talent was dismissed based on gender? As evening approached, Lucia prepared to leave but paused at the door. What will you do with the violin now? It was a question Mia hadn't fully considered. Professor Donovan had mentioned museum interest. Julia had suggested auction houses where historical instruments sometimes fetched remarkable sums. But neither option felt right. I think, Mia said slowly, that it needs to be played. To finally have the voice that was denied for so long. Lucia's smile was radiant. My grandmother used to say that a violin left silent was a story untold. She would be pleased. She pressed a business card into Mia's hand. I have my grandmother's journals, her notes on every instrument she created. Let me look through them. Perhaps I can find the specific entry for this violin. Every instrument had its own story. After Lucia departed, Mia, Thomas, and Eleanor sat in contemplative silence. The violin case lay open on the coffee table, the instrument inside gleaming in the soft lamplight. It was never about the money, Thomas said finally. But now? Now it's about justice, Mia finished. About making sure Bianca Rossi is finally heard. Eleanor, practical as always, spoke up. The question remains, how exactly do you give voice to a forgotten female artist from a century ago? Mia looked at the violin thoughtfully. An idea was taking shape, one that would connect past and present in a melody of recognition long overdue. The auditorium of the Westfield Community Center buzzed with anticipation. What had begun as a small event had swelled unexpectedly as word spread through music circles about the discovery of a lost Bianca Rossi violin. Local news had picked up the story, featuring interviews with Mia and Thomas about their unlikely restoration journey. Professor Donovan had published a preliminary paper in a prestigious music journal, and suddenly, Bianca Rossi was a name generating excitement among instrument historians and musicians alike. I never expected this many people, Mia whispered to Thomas as they peeked through the curtains at the gathering crowd. Nearly 200 attendees filled the seats, local residents, music students, faculty from Eastman, and even a representative from the National Museum of Musical Instruments. Neither did I, Thomas admitted, tugging uncomfortably at his tie. Eleanor had insisted they dress properly for the occasion, forcing him into his seldom-worn suit. Are you sure about this? We could still accept the museum's offer. The National Museum had expressed interest in acquiring the violin for their collection of historical instruments by underrepresented makers. The offer was generous, far more than the $200 Philip Hargrove had dismissively suggested. Absolutely sure, Mia replied. This feels right. In the 3 weeks since Lucia's visit, events had moved swiftly. Lucia had indeed found her grandmother's journal entry for the violin, number 17 in Bianca's personal catalogue, completed in April 1893 and named Speranza, Hope. According to the journal, Bianca had considered it one of her finest creations but had been forced to sell it unmarked during a period of financial hardship. The violin had changed hands multiple times before eventually disappearing from records during the Depression era. But the most significant development had been Mia's introduction to Daniela Rodriguez, a brilliantly talented 19-year-old violinist from Westfield's working-class East Side. Despite her exceptional abilities, Daniela had been forced to put her music education on hold, working 2 jobs to help support her family after her father's illness. 5 minutes, called the community center's manager from the side door. Mia nodded and made her way backstage where Daniela sat in quiet concentration, the restored violin, Speranza, carefully positioned on her lap. The young woman's fingers moved silently over the strings, rehearsing passages in her mind. "Nervous?" Mia asked. Daniela looked up, her dark eyes intense. "A little. It's not every day you get to play a rediscovered masterpiece. Remember what Lucia told you when you spoke?" A small smile appeared on Daniela's face. That her grandmother would be proud to have her violin played by another woman who refused to be limited by circumstances. Their conversation was interrupted by Thomas, who appeared with Lucia on his arm. Despite her age, Lucia had insisted on traveling back from Chicago for the event. She carried a slim leather portfolio, Bianca's original design sketches for the violin, which would be displayed in the lobby alongside photographs and journal excerpts. "It's time," Thomas said simply. The lights dimmed as Mia took the stage. Facing the audience, she found herself momentarily transported back to school recitals where she had introduced nervous young musicians to parents and friends. But this was different, this was completing a circle that had begun over a century ago. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began. "What started as a $3 purchase at a garage sale has become a journey of rediscovery, not just of an instrument, but of a remarkable woman whose talent went unrecognized in her lifetime." Mia briefly recounted the story of finding the violin, the restoration process with Thomas, and the discovery of Bianca Rossi's identity. She acknowledged Lucia, who stood to warm applause, and explained the violin's significance in the landscape of female luthiers whose contributions had been historically minimized. "But discovering the past is only half of our purpose tonight," Mia continued. "Instruments are meant to be played, to create beauty in the present. Bianca Rossi named this violin Speranza, Hope. Tonight, we connect her hope with the future of music in our community." She introduced Daniela, explaining the scholarship fund they were establishing with proceeds from the event and contributions from local businesses. The fund would support young musicians from underserved backgrounds, ensuring talent would never again be silenced by circumstance. As Daniela took the stage, Mia joined Thomas and Eleanor in the front row. Thomas reached over and squeezed her hand briefly, a rare display of emotion from her normally reserved friend. When Daniela drew the first notes of Bach's Partita No. 2 from Speranza, the audience fell into reverent silence. The violin's voice filled the auditorium with extraordinary richness and clarity, not merely the technical excellence of a well-crafted instrument, but something more profound. It was as if a century of silence had distilled into pure emotion, finally released through Daniela's skilled hands. Mia found herself thinking of all the hands that had touched this violin, Bianca's as she crafted it, the unknown musicians who had played it before it was forgotten, Thomas's weathered fingers restoring it piece by painstaking piece, and now Daniela's, bringing it back to glorious life. Each had contributed to this moment of redemption. After the Bach, Daniela played a piece specifically commissioned for the occasion, a modern composition titled Renaissance that incorporated themes of discovery, recognition, and renewal. As the final notes faded, there was a moment of breathless silence before the audience erupted in applause. During the reception that followed, Mia watched as Daniela carefully showed the violin to a group of young music students, their faces alight with interest. Nearby, Lucia was deep in conversation with Professor Donovan, who was taking notes with obvious excitement as she shared details from her grandmother's techniques. "We did good," Thomas said, appearing at her elbow with 2 glasses of champagne. "Better than good." "Yes," Mia agreed, accepting the glass. "Though I never expected any of this when I handed over those $3. "That's the thing about value," Thomas replied, watching as Philip Hargrove, who had arrived late and looked thoroughly chagrined, examined the display of Bianca's sketches with newfound respect. "Most people only recognize it when someone else points it out first." Later that evening, as the crowd thinned, Daniela approached Mia with Speranza carefully cradled in her arms. "I still can't believe you're entrusting this to me for the scholarship concert tour," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Who better?" Mia replied. "Bianca made this violin to be played, not displayed behind glass. And you'll be sharing her story across the country." "And yours," Daniela added. "The teacher who saw value where others saw junk." Mia smiled, watching as Thomas helped Lucia into her coat, the two of them discussing the merits of different varnish compositions with the animation of fellow craftspeople. "That's what teaching is all about," she said simply. "Seeing potential before it's obvious to everyone else." As they locked up the community center that night, Mia paused to look at the stars. She thought about how objects, like people, sometimes needed someone to believe in them before they could reveal their true worth. How recognition might come late, but was no less meaningful when it arrived. How the things others dismissed as worthless often contained the most profound value. And how sometimes, it took just one person willing to look deeper, to invest time rather than simply move on, to transform the abandoned into the extraordinary. The restored violin, Speranza, would now tell 2 stories, Bianca's of talent constrained by the prejudices of her time, and Daniela's of potential unleashed by opportunity. Different centuries, different circumstances, but connected by the universal truth that nothing, and no one, is ever truly worthless when seen through the right eyes.